All right, welcome back. We're session 2 or version 2, whatever we want to call episode 2 of our channel office hours. And so we've got 2 agronomists here today. We've got let the traffic kind of roll in as we go live across Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube is the new one this time around. So excited to be on that platform live. We got Todd Vagts from Minnesota. You might remember from our first one. For those of you who are coming back the second time. And then Pat Koenig from Nebraska is joining us for first time this time around. So welcome both of you. Thanks for joining us here today. All right. Good deal. Good morning. Yeah. So today, guys, we're going to dive into the wonderful world of tar spot and white mold. Usually something we don't typically address until the middle of the season, but 2 very big and important diseases that impact corn and soybeans, and want to get into those and kind of think through some of the management practices that growers and some of our Channel SeedPros are looking at as we dive into the 2025 growing season, which will be here before we know it, believe it or not, we're a couple days from March. So Todd, I'll start with you here. Just about tar spot, it's the new kid on the block. What are some of the things you've observed in Minnesota? We know it kind of started in 2018 down in northern Illinois, but it sort of has, gradually, I guess, or maybe too quickly for some, has spread across a good chunk of the Midwest here. So tell us about your experience in observing tar spot and some of the things your growers in your area of Minnesota have seen with it too.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so I am specifically located in southeast Minnesota. So people familiar with the state, I'm down in Lanesboro, which is southeast of Rochester. So our geography, it's made up with a lot of minimum till, no till, rolling hills, smaller fields, and all that kind of stuff. So just kind of a perfect environment for tar spot to flourish and thrive. We first encountered the disease in 2019. We found it in fields later in the season, so it was pretty minor. 2020 it was present, but again, it didn't really come in until later. 21 is when we really started to see it show up more significantly again, and this is mostly east southeast part of the state. And then 2022 is when it hit really hard in a kind of a local area, what I would call an acute affected area, Fillmore County. Your typical where you would see 100, 120 bushel yield losses from that type of situation. So that was 22, 23, then drought year was pretty minor. And then 24 last year, we had a pretty significant outbreak again, except this is a little further north, up north of Goodhue County. And so pretty significant in that area as well, again, where we saw those 100 plus bushel yield losses. So unfortunately, we've had a fair amount of experience with it, still learning a lot, but I think we're starting to get a little better handle on what's causing it, what we need to do to be able to move past it in that sense.
Yeah. And can you just kind of briefly, Todd, before we go over to Pat's angle on this, what were some of any weather oddities or observations you made that sort of made those years that sort of they seemed like they kind of spike and come and go? What were some of the things you maybe noticed in your part of the world on that?
So for our geography, and I think it may be a little different from one geography to the next, but a couple of things that I found to be very significant and important. First of all, is the overwintering inoculum. If we have a year, if it's maybe taken a couple of years to build up some inoculum levels, and then if we get fairly high infection level, at least later in the season, the prior year, depositing a lot of inoculum on the surface of the ground, and then going into the next year, that's, it's kind of this disease triangle. You got to have the inoculum. And then the other part of that is the environment. And what seems to be critical again for us is heavy precipitation in June. Oftentimes we can go back to these really acute hotspot areas and isolate those areas where we have excessive precipitation in June. And that's really kind of what in my mind at least, gets that disease started. So we get the disease started, and if we find it in June, late June, early July, that is a precursor to a huge problem, and that's kind of what gets that disease, driving the disease. And then somewhat moisture into July to kind of propel that disease forward. And then once it gets going in July, and then we can see big problems. But that's kind of those acute disease areas. When we get it where it comes in middle, later August, it can be problematic, but we're not going to see these 100 bushel yield losses. But an inoculum, heavy precipitation in June are, two of the larger factors that we look at.
Gotcha. And moving over to Pat here. So if you can kind of replicate a little bit just for your geography, Pat, your guys' experience maybe was a year or two off given your location, but kind of walk through what you guys experienced over in Nebraska with tar spot onset.
Yeah, we're a little later to the party than Todd was there in eastern Minnesota. So actually, tar spot was first confirmed in Nebraska in 2021 by one of my counterparts in southeast Nebraska, Austin Mers, and really very light pressure in 21 and 22, I would say, and pretty much isolated to the southeast portion of the state, so kind of south and east of Lincoln, Nebraska. Then in 23, we kind of saw it expand, and it gradually expanded in 22 as well, kind of along the Missouri River on the eastern side of the state and moved west. But really in 23, we didn't see probably significant yield losses in most of the state. And again, similar to other areas, pretty dry in 23, especially in the later half of the summer. Last year in 24 was probably when we saw it really expand. Without having the map in front of me, I can't say exactly how far west it went by county, but as far west as Highway 281, which is kind of in the central corridor of the state, and farther west than that as well. But I saw some significant yield losses in 24, especially in the northeast portion of the state. Probably not to the level that Todd talked with 100 bushel yield losses, but definitely economically significant. So it's definitely blown up here over the last couple of years, and it's probably here to stay. Yeah. Obviously, to Todd's point, overwinters on residue, and we're going to continue to fight it here in the coming years.
So Pat, when speaking of fighting it and management, what are some of those you guys have kind of maybe leaned on folks like Todd because they have a few more years experience, but what are some of those management practices you guys are kind of talking about within the channel brand, the SeedPros, and even the Bayer portfolio, some of those options as you think through the management of tar spot?
Well, yeah, it's a great point. We've leaned on the agronomists to the east of us because they have multiple years of experience of managing through tar spot. The interesting thing in Nebraska in particular is we're very, very heavily irrigated, high percentage of irrigated acres. So we kind of make our own microenvironment in a lot of those fields and those irrigated acres, and create some conditions a lot of times that are very, very conducive to tar spot. So, tar spot likes those more moderate temperatures with moisture, to what Todd brought up earlier. And, we create that when we're running those irrigation systems in the summer. So, the most important thing I would say is creating a plan to begin with. Obviously, fungicide to me is probably the key point. We talk about managing tar spot. We can help manage through it through hybrid tolerance. No hybrid's bulletproof on it, but really it's that fungicide management piece and having a plan in place on what you're going to do if you have an infestation, and that can be adjusted depending on how early you see pressure move in, to what severity it is. Right now in Nebraska, we're kind of focused just on that tassel application of a fungicide, particularly Delaro Complete, to try to help manage it, and then kind of have that second application in our back pocket if we need it. We're probably not there yet with the pressure we've seen in most areas, but definitely tassel application
Yeah.
planned right
And
now.
real quick, Pat, while we're still here with you, like you mentioned, your environment's a little bit different with the dry land and irrigated. Kind of those environments certainly have different experiences or different management when it comes to water management for sure. Can you kind of maybe touch on that a little bit of just where that breakdown is at tar spot is impacting sort of, if you had to put a number on the number of acres that have seen it in the last couple of years, is that something we should address or kind of think about as they go into 25 from the farmer perspective?
Well, I definitely think from a scouting perspective, probably focus on those irrigated acres. Obviously, we're going to have pressure in the dry land acres, but on a year that maybe we're on the drier side, we would expect probably less pressure on those dry land acres. But if it's dry and we're irrigating heavily, we would expect pressure in those irrigated acres. So we probably in a lot of areas focused our scouting on those irrigated acres just because in a more arid environment in a lot of Nebraska, we wouldn't expect to see as heavy a pressure on those dryland acres. Not that we won't, and we don't want to forget about those dryland or rain-fed acres, but most of our focus has been on the irrigated acres in a lot of areas of the state.
And as we transition to Todd for the Minnesota perspective in management, hey, if you got a question, pop it in the chat. I forgot to mention that earlier, but we're taking questions here. This is for farmers, seed pros, and others to kind of pick the brains of our experts in the field from the agronomy side. So happy to take your questions. We'll get to them as they pop in here. But as we keep going, Todd, your management recommendations for Minnesota might differ slightly, as Pat sort of alluded to. There may be more of that one fungicide, Delaro Complete, Delaro application. You guys might be looking at a different setup. Can you kind of talk through what you guys have been sort of recommending to the farmer customers out there?
Sure. Yeah. And it's, the bulk of it is very similar. That R1 application just post tassel is pretty common. But yeah, there's a lot of, this is, again, it's a pretty unique disease in the fact that oftentimes when we look at diseases, we look at, corn on corn acres being higher risk type situation. But uniquely from my observations, at least, I tend to find this disease more common in rotated acres or acres that maybe have less tillage. And again, in my opinion, that comes back to that surface inoculum that gets deposited the previous fall. The less that we're burying that inoculum, we have more inoculum present on the soil surface to be splashed up on corn leaves in the spring. So I guess when I'm talking to our customers, it's those rotated fields that were corn on soybeans that are maybe higher risk, or where we've actually seen some of our highest intensity diseases are no-till fields on sod ground, which again is just the complete opposite of what you'd ever expect. So if we're going into, where we have dairies, where we have alfalfa that was killed off the previous fall, no-till in those fields, we have that surface inoculum present. Those are fields that are super high risk. No-till cornfields going into bean stubble, high risk. And generally, as we get higher and higher tillage, and generally as we move further west in Minnesota, west of I-35, we tend to get more tillage on heavier ground. We maybe see tar spot later in the season from inoculum that's blowing around, but we don't necessarily get those early infections. But beyond that, those R1 applications. But again, even in our geography where we have a lot of smaller fields, a lot of woods, just getting application can be a little bit challenging. So we have a lot of helicopters that are putting fungicide on, drones that are doing it. And then we have some people that are going in with just ground rigs that are going in prior to tassel, where they can still get a ground rig in and putting a fungicide on. So it'd be like a V14, V16 application, and then maybe following up with that R2 or R3 application if needed, and that would be by air in that situation. But by going in that late vegetative, we can get that higher volume water application to get more of the fungicide down deeper into the canopy. And that's really where that early infection is occurring, is deeper in the canopy. So that really helps out in that sense too. So we kind of look at a lot of different strategies. And just because, again, when we get these really, widespread blown infestations. We just don't have enough aerial applicators to go around. So we just kind of attack it with anything that we have available.
Gotcha. Yeah, and when you're looking at that R1 application, Todd, it's the tassel and reproductive stages, right? That first window of that repercussions. So you really want to protect that ear leaf is sort of what I've been hearing people talk about, is the importance of getting it in right at that reproductive stage, so you can have a full attack it as best you can when that disease is. And that's the other thing about tar spot that we're learning too, is it's there and you may not even observe it right away, even though scouting, so that vigorous scouting program is super important especially in areas that have already been impacted by it.
Yes, scouting is extremely important. And again, somewhat of a unique disease, and from my experience and perspective, scouting on this is a little bit easier than a lot of other diseases. Typically, when we find tar spot, it's right on the outer edges of the field first. So I typically say, if you want to scout it, you just go to the edge of your field and maybe 1 to 2 rows. That's where you'll generally find it first. And so that scouting in that sense is easy, but still it's always good to go into the field and see if there's other things going on. But oftentimes it's those outer rows that get infested first. So scouting, and then again, if you get that early infestation in June, early July, that R1 or a late vegetative is imperative to get that on for that protective fungicidal activity that'll 2 to 3 weeks, and then go back in and evaluate at that R2 or 3 time frame to kind of see if that disease is, it's kind of hard to evaluate it because it's still there, but it's stopped, but is it progressing up the plant? And as you mentioned, protecting that ear leaf is extremely important. So we kind of look at that ear leaf, and the 1 to 2 above that ear leaf is extremely important. Keeping that upper canopy clean, very, very important to protect the yield potential of the crop.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And tar spot, maybe we should have covered this earlier, right? It's like you took a black permanent marker and just sort of put it on the leaf. It won't come off if you scrape it or whatnot. If it does come off, it's probably fly poop.
Yes.
The second time we've mentioned poop in our calls for these. So we got a thing going, I guess.
And oftentimes too, what I often say is, a lot of times we say scrape it, but oftentimes if you find that black speck, if you flip the leaf over, you'll see some necrosis on the backside of the leaf too. So if you get sick of licking tar spot or bug poop from your thumb or whatever, oftentimes you just flip the leaf over. If you can see it on both sides of the leaf, you got tar spot. So
yeah, good deal.
Fly sticks.
And Pat, we've got you mentioned this earlier about hybrid selection or product selection. Can you kind of talk through what some of the products that you not necessarily product numbers or anything like that, but just what you guys look at as you are getting new information about this disease? What are some of the things that you kind of talk through with SeedPros and customers as we think through those product selection discussions?
Yeah, so because tar spot is fairly new, honestly, to the agronomy world, we didn't really have if you go back 10 years ago, we didn't have any system to rate products on tar spot. So we've started that process of getting some inoculated trials out there and begun rating our hybrids. That's still a work in progress, but we kind of look at it as below average, average, and above average when we talk about rating products. And we probably aren't to the point where we're completely going to kick a product out of the lineup because it's maybe on the below average side on tar spot. We kind of use that as a management tool on, hey, where do we need to look first? If we're going to target a fungicide application, maybe where we would start, or maybe where we would plan on 2 fungicide applications. But we've used that as a management tool here, starting last year and moving forward on just placing products, if we're in a high risk environment or managing, throughout the season. And we definitely have a lot of products across the broad maturity range that are very solid on tar spot tolerance, and we can rely heavily on those in certain situations.
Yeah, good call. And we got a question I want to pop in from our chat that is it found on the outside first of the rows, I presume, Todd? I think this was a comment you were alluding to, because those plants have more wind damage. I'll kind of let you answer. I think I know what the answer is, but I'll let you take it from here.
Sure. So there's a couple of components to that. Some of the research out of the University of Wisconsin, Damon Smith, if people know him, some of his research has shown that sunlight actually has some impact on allowing that disease to progress. Again, something very opposite of what we typically expect with a disease. So the more sunlight, I think, helps to drive it. But the other factor, again, my opinion only on this, is I think on the edges of the field is where we have more surface inoculum present. So that, if you're doing any tillage on the field, you're bearing some inoculum, but around the edges, you don't have it. So again, any rainfall that you're having is splashing it onto the leaves of those outer plants around the edges of the field. I think you just have a higher inoculum load. Again, that's my own personal opinion on it, but that's kind of what I've come to figure out with this as well.
Yeah, okay, good deal. And also, when you talk about fungicides, always follow the label recommendations on that, and something we need to point out as we go through there. So let's move to white mold. We talked about tar spot being the new kid on the block. White mold has been around for a little while here. And it's something you guys in your area have dealt with as well, maybe more extensively than the tar spot disease. So let's go to Pat here and think about, white mold. Sort of give us the quick overview of what it is, how it infects soybeans, kind of the big broad overview. If you were to give us a 101 look at things there, Pat.
Well, yeah, just from a broad overview, we've fought white mold for a number of years in Nebraska. The interesting thing about white mold is, as you think about it, once you see white mold, it's probably too late to do anything. So it's definitely a disease that you have to plan ahead for. So that infection on white mold really occurs in that very early reproductive stage. So if you think about that R1, R2 time frame, and you can see on the graphic up there that really the infection is through those flowers, and then the disease progresses from there. And only one cycle per year, but what we've seen is, if you have conditions that are maybe not as conducive to white mold, it kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of goes dormant in that plant. And then when you get those cool, wet conditions that it prefers, it'll kind of flare back up and start its process again. So it's an interesting disease, hard to get a handle on, but really, not different from a lot of other diseases, likes those cooler, wetter environments, particularly, when we see that infection occur, prior to R1 or around R1, likes cool, wet environments then, and then as the disease progresses, likes that continued cool, wet environment down in the canopy. So, those sclerotonia on white mold can lay dormant in the soil for, multiple years, 5+ years. So rotation helps, but we don't always see, that as a ultimate cure-all. But, just definitely something we battled and continue to battle. Probably, in Nebraska, I would say number 2 or 3 most economically significant disease that we battle in soybeans.
Wow. And just real quick then, you mentioned the cool conditions. Is that why we see it mainly limited to the northern geographies on this one, because of your planting dates and, typically it's a cooler environment at that reproductive stage?
Yeah, in Nebraska, historically, it's been, kind of a northern Nebraska disease. Not that we've never seen it, in the South I-80 or in that geography, but typically been kind of a north of I-80 type disease, and primarily because of temperature. It gets cooler as we move north in Nebraska. As you move south, definitely more warmer temperatures and a little more arid environment as you move south and west. But yeah, temperature plays a huge role into that.
And so, Todd, as we think through the management from a white mold perspective, you've got, I think Pat mentioned some crop rotation things to consider. Row spacing, I know, is one that's 15s or 20s and 30s. I know that's a conversation some growers have sometimes. Give us your experience in what your recommendations are for farmers in Minnesota from a white mold management perspective.
Sure. Yeah, white mold is a continuous impact for us as far as soybeans go. Fortunately, on the variety selection aspect of it, we've been dealing with white mold for a long time, so we do have varieties that are quite tolerant to white mold. Nothing is resistant to it, but we certainly have a lot of breeding efforts that look at tolerance. There's multiple genes that work against this disease. So that would be the first and foremost thing is if you know that you have some significant white mold issues, looking at the variety tolerance and the ratings on that in that aspect. Probably our next biggest thing that we look at is plant population. And so we've been really driving soybean plant populations down as a white mold management strategy. And if we have history of it, and if we have variable seeding rate capabilities, I often recommend that in those areas where you have white mold, you can get down to 90 to 100,000 plants per acre seeding rate. It helps airflow, and then it helps to reduce that disease potential in that sense. So, variety selection, plant population, and then of course then use of foliar fungicides again at that R1, R2 into that R3. And again, this recommendation is changing somewhat. Typically, we've recommended the R1 followed by an R3, but part of this too, I think, is with some of our earlier planting rate or dates on soybeans, where we're going, more into late April, early May planting. We're getting flowering earlier where we maybe don't have a full canopy yet. So waiting until maybe that R2-ish stage for that first foliar fungicide application. And then if you know that you're in a high risk situation, following it up again with that R3 type scenario for really good protection. And then, product selection is extremely important, with the Delaro Complete aspect of it with white mold management that has the group 7, the SDHI, the flupiram. That's the important component for white mold, rather than just, in our aspect of going Delaro to the Delaro Complete. So a lot of different tools that we have with white mold, and you kind of have to apply all of them to be able to get good management in that sense.
Yeah, you mentioned something that we see more about too is early planting for both crops, corn and soybeans. Can you kind of maybe from both your perspectives, Todd first here, we've seen that early planting date in soybeans continue even as you go north, even getting into those April timeframes. What has that sort of done and it's fairly recent, recent being 10, 15 years. What is some of the stuff you've observed, Todd, in your career and seeing that sort of move in early planting for both the crops and disease management practices, maybe overall, but certainly with a nod to white mold there?
Yeah, and for those that know me, I'm a big advocate of early soybean planting. So I push it maybe a little bit harder than I should sometimes, but I think it's very positive in a lot of aspects, and I think even with white mold, because we push that flowering to earlier. Typically in our geography, we'll see flowering anytime after July 4th, but when we get to these earlier plantings, we can see flowering occurring late June, early July, and a lot of those flowers don't stick, but at least we get that process started. And then if we do an early planting with a early maturity bean, oftentimes I think we can get a lot of our flowering done before we get into the white mold. Oftentimes you get later July into August, where you kind of those dog days of summer, where you get lower wind, more moisture in the canopy. And if you're still flowering at that time, we get a little bit higher disease infection opportunities. So if we get a lot of that flowering occurring earlier, before we get into that mid or later July and get our pod set at that point, we can avoid some of these disease situations. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of early planting.
So Pat, is it a disease that impacts the flower basically the fungus that goes after that flower piece of or flower part of the plant?
Well, that's where the infection occurs. Really the impact is not as much on the flower as it is, internally in the plant.
So it's kind of gateway into
basically
the plant itself then.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. The flower is just the infection point.
Got it.
The progression of the disease occurs outside of that.
That's why we want to focus on that R1 application on a fungicide if we're observing the disease. Okay. Got it.
Yeah, but to Todd's point, I think we've even seen a lot of data, and a lot of it probably comes from more of Todd's area to the north. But if we can push that application window back to that R2, I think it's as good or maybe a better timing, just because we have more flowers exposed, and get protecting more of that plant, and just pushing that application window back to give us a longer period of protection.
Gotcha.
A lot of times in Nebraska, we focused on R1 because coverage is a little bit easier. The beans aren't quite canopied. We can drive that product down across the whole plant, but R2 is a great application timing as well.
Okay, good deal. Anything else on white mold that you guys want to cover off here? I think we get the high points on a management perspective and some things you guys are seeing in your areas.
I think you hit pretty good.
Okay. All right, good deal. There's a question in the chat. I want to try to throw at you guys, and it might be more of a we have to look at some extension research, or even we have internal stuff maybe. But is there any research on the differences in tar spot? Coming back to the tar spot severity between 30, 20s, and 15s in row spacing in corn? Either of you have an insight or question on that one? Comment, sorry.
I don't have any research off the top of my head that I've seen, but anecdotally, we've definitely seen in our area the severity is, we don't have a lot of 15-inch row corn, but a lot of 20-inch corn in Nebraska. We've seen the severity be a little higher in 20-inch corn. There's just, it just creates, a different environment when you start squeezing those rows a little closer together, a little more humid environment in that canopy later in the season. So infection level, is probably the same, because the inoculum load was the same coming, from the prior year, but the severity seemed to increase a little bit faster in those narrow rows, I would say.
Same for you, Todd?
I haven't seen, we're mostly on 30s, but my guess would be that the 20s or 15s be more challenging. And if anything, if you're applying that foliar fungicide, just getting it down into that canopy, protecting those lower leaves might be a little bit more challenging in that narrower rows.
Sure. Gotcha. All right. Well, we've covered two big topics today: tar spot management, white mold management. Two big, economically impactful too, in this time of commodity prices where they are, and things being a little tighter across the countryside. Thinking about how to manage diseases is super important this season. Any disease, but in particular these two economically important ones. So come back to Todd here, and both of you to answer this, but final comment or two as you sort of put in the crystal ball on February 27th here, as we get ready to plant here in another month or so for some of the country. What are one for each disease? What is one thing you're kind of looking at, or one last sort of takeaway you'd leave our listeners with here?
Well, I guess from my perspective, we have about 45 days of planning yet, and as Pat mentioned, just make a plan, for both diseases. Talk with your seed pro, find out what the tolerance level of both, whether it's a corn or soybean, and then make that plan with your seed pro on the scouting aspect of it, on the if you're going to use foliar fungicide, if you're managing populations, all that different kind of stuff. It's, as Pat mentioned, just get that plan going. So right now is the time to do it.
Good deal. Pat?
Yeah, I think that's the main point right there, is having a plan in place. Some time to adjust here, maybe move some products around as far as placement if you got fields that are maybe high risk, maybe you shift some placement around on hybrids or varieties you currently have purchased or have planned on, but just really have that plan in place, because we all know how hectic spring is, and then spring turns into summer pretty quick, and we're right in the heat of disease time frame. So having the plan in place up front is always key.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one other point we'd want to make to the audience here is if you have questions about white mold, tar spot management, recommendations, products, reach out to your local technical agronomist, your Channel SeedPro. They can, if they don't know the answer, they can get you the answer. That's what they're there for, is to help provide that good customer experience for you guys in the field. So, I want to thank Todd and Pat for their time today. One last plug for Channel here as we wrap up the show. The Commodity Classic starts this week, which is usually sort of the unofficial start to planting in my mind. It'll be here shortly thereafter. It's out in Denver this week. Todd is actually going to be there, so if you're paying attention and you're going to Classic, visit with Todd. He'll be there to answer any further questions you guys have about anything, right, Todd? Anything you want.
That's right.
Yeah. So last plug for Classic there. We'll have a lot of Channel stuff going on in our booth, and so please stop by if you're visiting Classic. Otherwise, we want to thank again Todd and Pat for joining us today. And you guys take care, and we'll see you again hopefully next month toward the end, and we'll talk about some things that are getting ready for planting season. So thanks again, Todd and Pat. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.